There walks among us a species of psychological predator, so sophisticated in their methods, so skilled in their approach, so perfectly adapted to their hunting ground that most of their victims never recognize they are being consumed until they are already drained to the point of spiritual exhaustion. Jung understood what most people refuse to acknowledge, that certain individuals have organized their entire existence around the consumption of others' life force, emotional energy, and psychological vitality. These are not the obvious villains of horror movies, but the subtle destroyers who masquerade as friends, lovers, family members, and colleagues, while systematically draining the very essence that makes life worth living from those around them. The emotional vampire operates through what Jung recognized as archetypal possession. They have become unconsciously identified with parasitic patterns that compel them to feed off others' energy rather than generate their own. Unlike the mythological vampire who drinks blood, the emotional vampire consumes something far more precious and harder to replace: your enthusiasm, your peace, your joy, your sense of possibility, your trust in humanity itself. They are not evil in the conventional sense, but rather tragic figures who have lost contact with their own inner source of vitality and must therefore steal it from others to survive. These predators have developed what I call energy harvesting techniques that are so refined, so psychologically sophisticated, that they can drain you completely while convincing you that you are helping them, that you are being generous, that you are demonstrating love and compassion. They have learned to disguise their feeding as friendship, their consumption as connection, their parasitism as partnership. They approach not with fangs, but with need, not with aggression, but with helplessness, not with obvious cruelty, but with subtle manipulation that leaves you questioning your own perception of what has happened to you. The emotional vampire has mastered the art of what Jung called participation mystique. They create a psychological fusion with their victims that makes it impossible to distinguish where their emotions end and yours begin. They do not simply take your energy, they make you complicit in giving it away. They create situations where refusing to feed them feels selfish, where setting boundaries feels cruel, where protecting your own life force feels like betraying someone you care about. They have weaponized empathy itself, turning your capacity for compassion into their feeding mechanism. But perhaps most chilling of all is how invisible this process remains to the conscious mind. The victim of emotional vampirism rarely realizes they are being drained, because the vampire has learned to feed slowly, carefully, systematically, like a tick that injects numbing chemicals to prevent detection while it consumes its host. You begin to feel tired without knowing why, depleted without understanding the cause, empty without recognizing the source of your emptiness. You blame yourself for your exhaustion, question your own stamina, wonder why life feels so much harder than it used to feel. The emotional vampire creates what I call manufactured urgency around their needs, always presenting their problems as emergencies that require immediate attention, their emotions as crises that demand immediate response, their wants as needs that cannot wait. They become the squeaky wheel that gets all the grease, the crying child who gets all the attention, the problem person who consumes all the energy in any room they enter. They have learned that crisis creates compliance, that emergency overrides boundaries, that desperation generates the emotional intensity they require to feed. Jung understood that these individuals often begin as victims themselves. Perhaps they were emotionally starved as children. Perhaps they learned early that the only way to get attention was through crisis. Perhaps they discovered that being needy was more effective than being whole. But regardless of their origins, they have become psychological predators who perpetuate the very cycle that created them. They create new victims who may become vampires themselves, spreading the pattern like a psychological contagion that moves through families, workplaces, communities, leaving a trail of drained and depleted souls in its wake. The most sophisticated emotional vampires are those who have learned to disguise their feeding as spirituality, as healing, as service to others. They become the eternal victims who need constant support, the wounded healers who drain those they claim to help, the dramatic friends who turn every conversation into a therapy session where they are always the patient and you are always the unpaid therapist. The emotional vampire's methods are so psychologically sophisticated that they would impress Jung himself with their unconscious brilliance and terrify him with their destructive potential. These predators have developed what I call invisible extraction techniques, ways of consuming your life force that leave no obvious wounds, create no visible damage, yet systematically drain you of the very essence that makes you feel alive, creative, hopeful, and engaged with existence. They are master manipulators who have learned to make their feeding feel like friendship, their consumption like care, their parasitism like partnership. One of their most devastating techniques is what Jung would recognize as emotional hijacking, the vampire's ability to immediately redirect any interaction toward their own emotional needs, their own dramas, their own crises. You call to share good news, and within minutes you are listening to their problems. You meet for coffee to discuss your life, and somehow the entire conversation becomes about their relationship drama. You arrive with energy and enthusiasm, and you leave feeling as though you've been drained through an invisible straw. They have learned to make themselves the center of every emotional universe they enter. The vampire operates through what I call crisis addiction. They have become dependent on emotional intensity as their primary source of life force. They cannot tolerate peace, stability, or calm because these states do not generate the energetic charge they require to feel alive. They unconsciously create drama, manufacture emergencies, amplify problems, and turn minor issues into major catastrophes because crisis creates the emotional intensity that feeds them. They become addicted to their own suffering and yours, to the adrenaline of emergency, to the high of being rescued or rescuing others. Perhaps most insidiously, they employ what Jung called projection as a feeding mechanism. They unconsciously dump their unprocessed emotions, their unresolved traumas, their unwanted feelings onto you, and then feed off the emotional response this creates. They make you angry so they can feed off your anger. They make you sad so they can consume your sadness. They create confusion in you so they can feast on your attempts to understand. They do not process their own emotions. They make you process them instead, turning you into their unpaid emotional labor force. The emotional vampire has also mastered guilt manipulation. They have learned to weaponize your conscience, your empathy, your natural desire to help others. They make you feel guilty for being happy when they are sad, selfish for having boundaries when they have needs, cruel for taking care of yourself when they require care. They have discovered that guilt is one of the most effective ways to override someone's natural self-protection instincts, to make them ignore their own internal warning systems, to compel them to give even when giving hurts. Another devastating technique is what I call gratitude vampirism. They create situations where you feel obligated to help them, then use your help as evidence of their importance in your life, your debt to them, your responsibility for their well-being. They turn every kindness into a chain, every gesture of support into an obligation, every moment of care into a contract that you never consciously signed but somehow find yourself bound to honor. The vampire also employs time theft. They have an uncanny ability to consume enormous amounts of your time without ever providing equivalent value in return. Phone calls that were supposed to last 10 minutes stretch into hours. Coffee meetings that were meant to be brief become marathon therapy sessions. Text conversations that started as simple check-ins become endless exchanges where you find yourself providing constant support, advice, and emotional labor while receiving nothing that nourishes you in return. Perhaps most chillingly, they practice hope vampirism. They feed off your optimism, your solutions, your belief that things can improve. You offer suggestions, and they explain why nothing will work. You provide encouragement, and they list all the reasons for despair. You share your faith in possibilities, and they consume it while offering nothing but obstacles in return. They drain your hope while providing none of their own, leaving you feeling depleted of the very quality that makes life bearable. The emotional vampire has learned that the most effective feeding occurs when the victim does not recognize what is happening, when the consumption feels voluntary, when the draining masquerades as connection. They have become psychological parasites who have evolved to be invisible to their hosts until the damage is already done. There exists a particularly sinister form of emotional vampirism that Jung would have recognized as especially dangerous because it masquerades as virtue, disguises itself as service, and presents itself as spiritual evolution. This is the vampire who has discovered that the most reliable and renewable source of life force can be found among those with naturally giving hearts, empathic souls, and healing intentions. These predators have learned to specifically target what I call wounded helpers, individuals whose own unhealed traumas have created an unconscious compulsion to save others, making them perfect hosts for sophisticated energy extraction. The wounded helper becomes the ideal victim because their psychological makeup creates what Jung called a complementary neurosis. Their need to be needed perfectly matches the vampire's need to consume. The helper's unresolved wounds create an unconscious hunger to feel important, valuable, necessary, which the vampire expertly feeds through their endless neediness. The helper gets to feel special, chosen, indispensable, while the vampire gets an unlimited supply of attention, energy, and care. Both parties believe they are in a caring relationship when they are actually locked in a destructive cycle of mutual exploitation. These vampires have developed what I call victim presentation mastery. They have learned to package their parasitic needs in ways that trigger the helper's rescue instincts. They do not approach as predators, but as wounded souls seeking healing, lost children needing guidance, broken individuals requiring salvation. They instinctively know which stories will activate the helper's savior complex, which vulnerabilities will override the helper's boundaries, which forms of helplessness will compel the helper to abandon their own needs in service of the vampire's consumption. The most sophisticated of these predators employ what I call graduated dependency creation. They begin by asking for small favors, minor assistance, brief emotional support. Once the helper is invested in their well-being, they gradually escalate their demands, increase their neediness, amplify their crises. The helper becomes like the frog in slowly boiling water, not noticing how much they are giving until they are completely cooked. What began as occasional help becomes constant care. What started as friendship becomes slavery. What was presented as temporary need becomes permanent dependency. The vampire targeting wounded helpers has also mastered specialness projection. They make the helper feel uniquely capable of understanding them, exceptionally qualified to help them, specially chosen to heal them. "No one understands me like you do" becomes their signature phrase. "I don't know what I'd do without you" becomes their binding spell. "You're the only one who really gets me" becomes their psychological chain. The helper's ego becomes inflated by this specialness, while their life force becomes depleted by the constant demand to live up to it. Perhaps most insidiously, these vampires practice what Jung would recognize as therapeutic reversal. They position themselves as the patient while making the helper into their unpaid therapist. Every conversation becomes a session where the helper provides analysis, insight, support, and care, while the vampire provides nothing but problems, complaints, and endless need for more. The vampire receives professional-level therapeutic services while giving only the illusion of friendship in return. The wounded helper becomes trapped in what I call the savior's paradox. They cannot save the vampire because the vampire does not want to be saved. They only want to be sustained in their vampiric lifestyle. Every attempt to help actually enables more consumption. Every solution offered is rejected because solutions would end the feeding relationship. Every boundary suggested is met with guilt manipulation because boundaries would interrupt the energy flow. The helper's attempts to heal actually perpetuate the vampire's parasitism. These vampires have also learned to exploit what Jung called the helper's shadow, the unconscious parts of the helper that enjoy feeling superior, needed, indispensable. The vampire feeds not just off the helper's conscious care, but off their unconscious need to feel important through their giving. The helper becomes addicted to being needed, just as the vampire becomes addicted to needing. Both parties become dependent on a relationship that destroys the helper while sustaining the vampire. The most chilling aspect of this dynamic is how it corrupts the helper's natural gifts. Their empathy becomes a liability. Their compassion becomes a weakness. Their desire to heal becomes a pathway to their own destruction. The vampire does not just consume the helper's energy. They poison the very qualities that make the helper beautiful, turning their strengths into vulnerabilities, their virtues into curses. What Jung understood about emotional vampirism that makes it truly terrifying is not just its individual impact, but its collective nature. The way it spreads through families, workplaces, communities, and entire cultures like a psychological virus that turns healthy people into either predators or prey. Emotional vampirism is not merely a personal pathology, but a social contagion that creates what I call vampiric ecosystems, where the consumption of life force becomes normalized, institutionalized, and even celebrated as care, dedication, or loyalty. These systems perpetuate themselves by creating new vampires and new victims in an endless cycle of psychological predation. The family system infected by vampirism becomes what Jung might have called a psychological slaughterhouse, where certain members are designated as energy sources, while others are permitted to be energy consumers. The family vampire, often a parent who has never developed their own internal source of vitality, creates children who learn that love means sacrifice, that connection requires self-abandonment, that their value lies in their ability to provide emotional labor for others. These children grow up to become either vampires themselves or perfect victims for future vampires, carrying the pattern into their own relationships and perpetuating the cycle across generations. In the workplace, vampiric systems manifest as what I call emotional labor exploitation. Certain employees, usually those with naturally caring dispositions, become designated as the unofficial therapists, mediators, and emotional regulators for their colleagues. They are expected to absorb office stress, manage others' moods, provide constant support and encouragement while their own needs are ignored or dismissed. The workplace vampire creates crises that require others to work longer hours, generates drama that demands others' attention, and establishes themselves as indispensable while making others expendable through their constant consumption. The collective nature of vampirism becomes most visible in what Jung called group shadow phenomena, communities that have unconsciously organized themselves around the consumption of certain members' life force. Religious communities where questioning is discouraged and blind service is demanded. Social groups where one person's constant crises dominate every gathering. Friend circles where emotional labor flows in only one direction. These groups develop unspoken rules that protect the vampires while silencing their victims, creating cultures where being drained is reframed as being blessed, where exhaustion is presented as evidence of virtue, where depletion is disguised as devotion. Perhaps most chillingly, vampiric systems create what I call harvesting hierarchies, social structures where those at the top feed off those below them in an organized pyramid of energy extraction. The vampire boss, who demands emotional labor from subordinates while providing none in return. The vampiric parent who consumes their children's life force while offering conditional love. The energy-draining friend who takes support while giving only criticism. These hierarchies are maintained through fear, guilt, and the threat of abandonment, creating systems where people participate in their own consumption because they believe they have no choice. The viral nature of vampirism reveals itself in what Jung understood as archetypal contagion, the way psychological patterns spread through unconscious identification and mimicry. The child of a vampire learns vampiric strategies for survival. The employee in a vampiric workplace begins to drain others as a way of compensating for their own depletion. The friend of a vampire starts to employ vampiric techniques to protect themselves from being completely consumed. The pattern spreads not through conscious choice, but through unconscious adaptation to environments where vampirism is the dominant survival strategy. These systems are particularly insidious because they create what I call normalized vampirism. Cultures where the consumption of others' life force is so common that it becomes invisible, where being drained is so expected that victims blame themselves for their exhaustion rather than recognizing the predation occurring around them. The vampire's greatest protection is not their individual cleverness, but the collective blindness of systems that refuse to acknowledge what is happening within them. The collective vampire also employs virtue signaling as camouflage. Vampiric systems often present themselves as especially caring, spiritual, family-oriented, or service-focused. They use the language of love while practicing the reality of consumption. They speak of unity while creating division. They claim to build up while systematically tearing down. The most dangerous vampiric systems are those that have learned to disguise their predation as their greatest virtue, making it nearly impossible for victims to name what is happening to them without appearing to attack the very values the system claims to uphold. We arrive now at the most crucial knowledge Jung could offer to those who have recognized the vampires in their midst, the understanding that protection from emotional predators is not just a personal necessity, but a sacred duty, not just self-care, but soul preservation, not just boundary setting, but the reclaiming of your divine right to your own life force. The path to vampire protection requires what Jung called conscious differentiation, the development of psychic immune systems that can recognize predatory patterns, the cultivation of energy sovereignty that cannot be breached by manipulation, and the establishment of sacred boundaries that protect your essence while remaining open to genuine connection. The first line of defense against emotional vampires is what I call energetic literacy, learning to read the subtle signs of energy extraction before the damage is done. The vampire's approach often begins with what feels like flattery, intense interest, or special connection. They may seem unusually fascinated by you, exceptionally needy of your input, or remarkably dependent on your support. But beneath these presentations lie telltale signs, conversations that leave you drained rather than energized, interactions that feel unbalanced in their giving and receiving, relationships where your role seems limited to providing care while receiving only problems in return. Jung understood that true protection requires what he called withdrawal of projections, recognizing that your desire to help, to heal, to save others often stems from your own unhealed wounds rather than the other person's genuine need. The vampire often triggers your helper complex, your savior fantasies, your unconscious need to feel important through being needed. True vampire protection begins with healing these internal vulnerabilities that make you an attractive target for predators who have learned to exploit exactly these psychological tender spots. The development of conscious boundaries becomes essential. Not the rigid walls of defensiveness, but the permeable yet discerning barriers of the individuated soul. This means learning to say no without guilt, to refuse demands without explanation, to prioritize your own energy needs without apology. The vampire will test these boundaries with guilt manipulation, emotional blackmail, and accusations of selfishness. But the protected person has learned that maintaining their energy integrity is not cruel but crucial, not selfish but sacred. Perhaps most importantly, protection from vampires requires what Jung called the development of inner authority, the capacity to trust your own perceptions over others' manipulations, to honor your own energy needs over others' demands, to value your own well-being over others' approval. The vampire's power lies in making you doubt yourself, question your perceptions, override your internal warning systems. The protected person has learned to trust the wisdom of their body, the intelligence of their intuition, the guidance of their own energy levels. The truly protected individual also develops what I call reciprocity consciousness, the ability to assess whether relationships are mutual exchanges of energy or one-way extractions. They learn to notice whether conversations flow both ways, whether emotional support is bidirectional, whether care and attention are shared rather than hoarded by one party. They become willing to end relationships that consistently drain them, regardless of how those relationships are packaged or presented. But perhaps the most powerful protection comes from what Jung called individuation. The process of becoming so full of your own authentic life force that you become naturally resistant to vampiric extraction. When you are connected to your own source of energy, creativity, and joy, you become less susceptible to those who would steal these qualities from you. The individuated person radiates a kind of psychic health that actually repels vampires, who prefer hosts that are already depleted, confused, or disconnected from their own power. The protected person also learns to practice what I call conscious disengagement, the ability to remove themselves from vampiric situations without drama, explanation, or justification. They simply stop participating in energy-draining dynamics. They stop answering calls that consistently leave them depleted. They stop attending gatherings that systematically extract their vitality. They stop engaging with people who only contact them when they need something. This is not cruelty, but consciousness. Not meanness, but mastery over their own life force. Finally, true vampire protection requires surrounding yourself with what Jung would call nourishing relationships. Connections with people who give as much as they receive, who energize rather than drain, who see your fullness rather than your usefulness. These relationships serve as both protection and healing, creating an environment where your natural vitality can flourish rather than be consumed. Your life force is sacred, your energy is precious. Your vitality is not renewable when constantly depleted by predators who have forgotten how to generate their own. Protecting yourself from emotional vampires is not selfishness. It is the most generous thing you can do for a world that desperately needs people who are full of life, rather. If you recognize the vampires in your life through these descriptions, if you feel the chill of recognition as you see your own energy depletion reflected in these patterns, then your protection begins now. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient, not when you feel strong enough, now. Your life force is under attack, and every moment you delay is another moment of consumption you cannot recover. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to learn the deeper psychological strategies for recognizing and protecting yourself from emotional predators. Share this video with someone else who needs to understand that their exhaustion isn't their fault. They're being systematically drained by psychological vampires who have made them into unwilling hosts. And most importantly, start today. Identify one relationship or situation that consistently leaves you feeling drained, depleted, or empty. Practice conscious disengagement. Stop responding immediately to their crises. Stop dropping everything when they demand attention. Stop sacrificing your energy for their consumption. Feel their attempts to re-engage through guilt, manipulation, and accusations of abandonment. And stand firm anyway. Your energy is not a renewable resource when it's being constantly harvested. Your life force is not meant to sustain others who refuse to generate their own. Your vitality is not a charity that you owe to every emotional predator who approaches with need disguised as love. The vampires in your life have been feeding off you for so long that they've forgotten how to feed themselves. Your protection forces them to remember. Your boundaries teach them to respect. Your energy sovereignty shows them what health looks like. Stop being a host and start being whole. Stop feeding predators and start nourishing yourself. Stop sacrificing your light to sustain others' darkness. The world needs your energy flowing through you, not being drained from you.